Okay, in this video, we're actually gonna learn how to use reduce to run promises in a sequence, right? Now, some of you may think, hey, can't you do the same thing with promise.all? And no, you actually can't because promise.all does not guarantee the order that the promises run in. But this actually does, okay? And I will explain why at the end. But reduce is very different because remember, it allows you to return whatever type you want, right? So remember, promises allow you to chain .then at the end. Let's see how that works with reduce, okay? All right, so here I have function one. It just returns a new promise and then it resolves itself and it console logs P1 is resolved. Okay. I will make three promises, P1, P2, and P3. So this would be 2, this would be 3, and this will say 2 resolved and 3 resolved. Okay. And then I'm going to put all of these in an array. Let's do const all promises is equal to an array of P1, P2, and P3. Okay, now what can we do? Well, we can do all promises dot reduce. Remember, it takes in two arguments, accumulator and initial value. But in this case, each of our value or even our initial value will be a promise, right? So I will rename this next promise just for more readability. Okay. Now, what should our second argument be? Let's think about this. Well, in order to even use promises, our second argument in reduce has to return a promise. The easiest way is you do capital promise. This grabs the promise constructor function, right? And on that function or on its prototype, there's a method called resolve. And look, we're calling resolve because promise.resolve returns what? A promise, right? Which is what we need here. Okay. And then if you're gonna reject all of these, you can use promise.reject, right? Okay. And I will show you another way as well later on. Okay, so what are we doing in here? Remember, reduce, always need a return statement. But now what are we returning? Well, remember our accumulator on the first loop is now a promise. So we can do promise, which is ACC, dot, then. Remember, all promises will let you use the dot then method in it. But then what are we putting in as the argument for the then? Well, we can just put in next promise. Now, if you look on the right, it resolved in order. But let's talk about this. What's going on here? Well, on the first loop, we have a promise. Then JavaScript says, that's a promise, so I will let you do .then on it. And what does .then do? Well, .then takes in whatever argument you pass to it. In this case, it's a promise, right? Because .then only deals with promises. So .then remembers that, and in the second loop of reduce, act is now still a promise, right? Because it's the result of the last .then. And then it will keep on chaining promises until we get to the end. Cool, huh? Now, let's try something. What if instead of this, resolving right away, we're going to do a set timeout? Okay. Anonymous function. And then what's going to be inside? Well, I'm just going to do the same thing. So I'm going to call resolve. And then we're still going to console.log everything. But I'm going to make this delay by 2 seconds. Let's look on the right. 1, 2. Look, it's still in order, right? Since this one took longer, it actually waited for P1 to resolve before console.logging everything. Okay? So yes, even if there's a set timeout, reduce will guarantee that all of your promises run in the correct order that you put them in your array right here. Okay. All right, so now what if we take off this set timeout? Okay. And what if we put it on the third one right here? Set timeout, same thing. Then copy paste this. Let's make this 3 seconds. Let's see what happens. See, so the first two gets resolved, and then it waits for the third one to finish, and then it console.logs it. Okay. So in the case where our first promise was taking longer, The other two didn't run until the first one got resolved. In the second case, where our last promise takes the longest, it actually resolved the first two because it knew that, hey, 1 and 2 can be displayed first because they're the first two. And then when I'm done with the third one, I'm just going to add that on to your console. Okay, isn't that cool? Now remember, reduce is a synchronous method. Okay, but since it allows you to return whatever type and value you want, including an array, an object, a string, and yes, also a promise. And yes, it can even do functions and symbols. Okay? So that's what make promise chaining works for reduce, but it will not work for any other array methods. Let's say like map, filter, every, and sum. Why? Because all of these are predetermined to return something. Okay? Actually, they all return, well, map and filter returns an array, right? And every and sum returns either true or false. So you cannot change the type that they're returning. So then it will not work with promises because in order to chain promises, you need to be able to return promises, which reduce allows us to do. Okay, one more thing. Let's talk about the second argument. We say that it has to be a promise. Cool, right? But is there something else we can put here? Because if we put resolve, right, it's not going to run our reject statements. So what other promises can we do? Well, you may or may not know this, but every function that was prefixed by the keyword async, NIA6, actually always return a promise. So let's do async function. Let's just call this function test. And I'm not even going to put anything in the brackets. Okay, this will still return a promise. How can we check that? Well, let's put it here. Test, and then we're going to call this function. And look, it still works. Yeah. And remember, this only works if this returns a promise, which it does. Okay, so if we don't have a return statement, it returns a promise. What if we return like 5? Does it still work? Yeah, it still works. Okay, because the keyword async will make a function return a promise. To test it even further, we replace test with 5. Let's see what we get. We get act.then is not a function. Why is that? Because remember, the .then method is only callable if the variable before it is a promise, right? Right now, 5 is not a promise, so you cannot do 5.then. But calling test, even though it returns 5, it actually returns 5 as a promise. Okay? So that's why it works here. Okay, cool. In the next video, we're going to learn how to use async and await with reduce as well. Okay.